75,000. That is the number being moved around Washington right now as though it means something. 2 Marine Expeditionary Units, an Army Airborne Brigade, 2 Ranger Battalions, a couple of conventional divisions being talked about in corridors where people who have never planned a theater-level operation speak with the confidence of people who have. 75,000 troops, and the question nobody in the briefing rooms is being permitted to ask out loud is the only question that actually matters. Sufficient for what exactly? Because I have worked on the war plan for exactly this contingency. I know what the force requirement looks like when you run the actual math against the actual objective. And what I'm going to tell you in the next several minutes is going to make the 75,000 number look like what it is. Not a deployment, not a strategy, not a plan, a gesture. A very expensive, very dangerous gesture being executed by people who confused tactical aggression with operational competence and paid for that confusion with other people's lives. Let me start with the mission, because the mission is the thing nobody will define honestly. If the objective is to seize Kish Island, and that is genuinely being discussed as a viable option in rooms that should know better, then I want you to understand something about the history of Marines being sent to seize small islands in the face of a prepared, disciplined, dug-in defensive force, May 1975, Koh Tang Island. A Marine battalion landing team, the same force structure being discussed right now for Kish, was tasked with seizing an island smaller than the one we are now contemplating. What happened to them is not classified, and it is not ambiguous. Go look it up. Marines do not lose battles very often. We lost that one, decisively. Most of our helicopters were shot down or destroyed on the initial approach before the first Marine boot touched the beach. We left our dead behind on that island, something we do not do, because we evacuated under fire from a defensive force 3 to 5 times larger and better organized than our intelligence had predicted. 3 Marines were left alive on that island because we could not reach them during the extraction. They were captured by the Khmer Rouge and executed. Every single element of that catastrophe, the intelligence failure on force disposition, the anti-aircraft environment that negated our aviation advantage, the inability to sustain or resupply a beachhead under fire, the political pressure to execute an operation that the operational facts did not support. Every single one of those elements is present in the current planning for Kish Island at greater scale and against a more capable defender. The Iranians on Kish have been preparing for this specific scenario for years. They know the approach angles, they know the launch envelopes of our amphibious ships, they have pre-positioned weapons underground in configurations that our imagery intelligence can partially map but cannot fully characterize. They have had the tactical problem of an American Marine assault on their island positions as their primary planning assumption for the better part of a decade. And the Marines going toward that strait on 4 legacy amphibious warfare ships are not going to get close enough to the shore to even enter their own launch envelope. In 2019, General Berger, then Commandant of the Marine Corps, issued guidance stating explicitly that legacy amphibious ready groups are no longer viable in an environment where adversaries possess missiles capable of engaging those ships before they reach effective launch range. He was telling his civilian leadership that the force structure being proposed for exactly this kind of operation was obsolete against exactly this kind of threat. That assessment was not overturned by new capabilities. It was overturned by a new Secretary of Defense who had not read it. Stay with me, because the force sufficiency question and the military leadership question are not separate issues. They are the same issue, wearing different clothes. There is a reason the generals are not walking into Pete Hegseth's office and telling him this cannot be done. The reason is not that they lack the information. Every theater commander in that region knows the force requirement. Every J3 planner who has run the numbers knows the gap between what is being deployed and what the mission demands. The reason the generals are silent is that the process that produces American generals today does not select for the kind of officer who tells the Secretary of Defense what he does not want to hear. Your duty as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is to advise the president on military matters. The biggest piece of advice available to this president before this war began was, do not go to war thinking you can keep the Strait of Hormuz open, because there is nothing in the American order of battle capable of doing that at acceptable cost. Do not go to war thinking you can shut down Iranian ballistic missile launch capability, because history shows we do not do that well. Do not go to war believing your missile defense architecture will protect your forward bases, because it never has and it never will at the consumption rates this adversary can sustain. None of that advice was delivered. Or if it was delivered softly enough that the people who needed to hear it clearly could choose not to. This process has been building for 30 years. The politicization of senior military promotions did not begin with this administration, and it will not end with it. But it is produced at the moment when we most need officers with the institutional courage to say the unacceptable thing to the most powerful person in the room, a general officer corps whose primary professional competency is finding ways to execute orders rather than questioning whether the orders should be executed. And at the top of this chain right now sits Pete Hegseth. I want to be direct about Pete Hegseth because the situation requires directness rather than diplomacy. This is the most operationally incompetent person who has ever held the position of Secretary of Defense. Not the most controversial, not the most politically polarizing, the most operationally incompetent, a man whose military career peaked at a level where he might have served as a battalion operations officer and would very likely have been relieved from that position for cause. He became a Fox News personality, and Donald Trump, who evaluates military competence by the same criteria he uses to evaluate television ratings, fell in love with the way he talked. There's a fundamental difference between talking tough on a cable news panel and being the person responsible for the operational planning of a theater-level conflict against a military that has spent years preparing for exactly the scenario you are now executing. Hegseth does not understand that difference. More precisely, he does not know that he does not understand it, and that specific combination, radical confidence without corresponding competence, in the person signing the deployment orders for 75,000 American service members, is not a political problem. It is a force protection catastrophe waiting to announce itself. Let me tell you what the actual force requirement looks like for the mission that would need to be executed if the objective is genuinely to secure the Strait of Hormuz. The war plan I worked on required a Marine expeditionary force of division size, 25 to 30,000 Marines, to seize the port of Chabahar on the Iranian mainland, followed by approximately 150 to 200,000 Army soldiers to hold and push inland. Total force requirement to establish and sustain a corridor that would actually interdict Iranian strike capability against shipping, somewhere between 200 and 250,000 troops with full logistical support, pre-positioned equipment, and an air superiority environment that does not currently exist and cannot be created in the operational timeline being discussed. What we are sending is 75,000. Against a force that has been underground, dispersed, hardened, and specifically organized to defeat exactly this kind of operation in terrain that negates every tactical advantage we bring, in an electromagnetic environment that will degrade every sensor and communication system we depend on. The mathematics of that mismatch are not complicated. They are simply unacceptable to the people who would have to say them out loud in a room where the decision has already been made. And the decision was made by the same logic that produced this entire war, the logic of the fantasy. Washington and Tel Aviv went into this conflict on the operational assumption that killing one man, that removing the supreme leader, would cause the Iranian state to fracture internally in ways that would make all the difficult details of war irrelevant, no closed strait. No underground missile cities in 31 autonomous military districts, each capable of independent, sustained launch operations without reference to a central command node. No prepared island garrisons. No coordinated ballistic missile campaign that had been rehearsed and refined for years against specific target sets, including the radar infrastructure, the interceptor batteries, and the command structures that American and Israeli planners depended on to function. None of that would matter because the regime would collapse and the problem would solve itself. The State Department's own top counterterrorism official resigned before the first strike and stated publicly that Iran posed no imminent threat. The intelligence community's honest assessment of regime resilience was available to anyone who requested it through proper channels. The assessment that the Iranian government would fracture under military pressure was not a product of the intelligence community. It was a product of the Israeli strategic community's wishful thinking, transmitted into American planning circles by people who had a vested interest in believing it. I want to be precise about how catastrophically wrong that assumption was, because understanding the magnitude of the error is the only way to understand the magnitude of the problem we now face. The regime did not collapse. A new IRGC commander was named within 24 hours. A new supreme leader was designated within a week. Iranian cities filled with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, not to protest the government, but to demand that the government not negotiate, not stop, not accept any terms that looked like accommodation. That is not the behavior of a population that has turned against its leadership under military pressure. That is the behavior of a nation that has been preparing psychologically and materially for this moment for a very long time and regards itself as prevailing. And by every operational metric that matters, interceptor expenditure rates, base evacuations, embassy closures, shipping insurance collapse, oil price trajectory, Allied refusal to commit forces, the absence of a coherent American end state, the Iranian assessment of its own position is not propaganda. It is accurate. The people who told you this war would be over in days were operating from a fantasy, and 75,000 American service members are now being positioned inside the consequences of that fantasy with a mission they cannot accomplish under leadership that will not say so, managed by a Secretary of Defense who does not know what he does not know. That combination, strategic miscalculation, tactical insufficiency, institutional silence, and operational overconfidence, is not a recipe for a difficult campaign that eventually finds its footing. It is a recipe for something much more serious, and the American public deserves to hear that said plainly, without the management and the softening and the vocabulary substitutions that have characterized every official statement about this war since the moment the first missile landed on the wrong side of the calculation. We have lost this war in the strategic sense that matters most. We cannot achieve through military means what we went to war to achieve, and we cannot sustain the economic and political costs of continuing to try. That is the sentence that nobody in a position of authority will say out loud. I am saying it. And the sooner the people who need to hear it find a way to act on it, the fewer names will end up on the memorial that eventually gets built for the service members we are sending into a mission the math does not support. Now, let me talk about the negotiations, because the word is being used in American media coverage of this conflict in a way that requires direct correction. There are no negotiations. What there is a channel. Witkoff and Kushner have transmitted or attempted to transmit an American position through Egyptian intermediaries and other back channels to the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, not to the foreign minister, not to the president, not to the supreme leader, all of whom are alive, regardless of what the president's social media account suggested about their status in the opening days of this conflict. Trump said they were dead. They are not dead. The foreign minister gave an interview on American television. The president is conducting government business. The supreme leader has been formally designated and is exercising his constitutional authority. The choice of the parliamentary speaker as the target interlocutor is not an accident of diplomatic access. It is a psychological warfare operation. By routing the communication through a legislative figure rather than through the legitimate foreign policy apparatus, Washington is signaling that it does not recognize the authority of the existing government and is searching for alternative power centers inside the Iranian system that it can engage separately. The Iranians understand this immediately and precisely because this specific playbook drive wedges between institutional actors, create the appearance of negotiating with some while delegitimizing others, use the negotiation process itself as a destabilization tool, has been run against them before. Specifically, it was run against them by Witkoff and Kushner in the pre-war contacts that Tehran now understands were used to map targeting parameters rather than to genuinely pursue a diplomatic arrangement. The question of why Iran would negotiate in good faith with the same two individuals a third time is not complicated. It answers itself. Meanwhile, the Iranian foreign minister is on American television explaining with considerable patience that Iran has not requested a ceasefire and is not currently engaged in negotiations. The Iranian government has not changed its message or its position once since this war began. It said before the first strike what it would do if struck. It did exactly what it said it would do. It told the Gulf governments what would happen to every base hosting American forces if Washington used those bases for offensive strikes against Iranian territory. Washington used those bases. Every base that had been partially evacuated in advance was struck on February 28th, precisely as Tehran had said it would be. The Iranians told us. They told the Gulf governments. They executed exactly what they announced. That is not luck. That is not improvisation. That is the operational consistency of a military and political leadership that made its strategic decisions years ago and is now executing against a pre-established plan with the discipline of an organization that does not change its assessment based on what its adversary says on social media. The contrast with the American communication pattern could not be more analytically instructive. The president told one outlet the war would last 4 weeks. He told another there were no time limits. He described the situation as very complete, a phrase that carries no operational or strategic meaning in any context I have encountered across 4 decades of studying how militaries communicate about active conflicts. The Secretary of Defense went on national television the same day and announced this was only just the beginning. When a reporter asked the president which statement was accurate, he said you could say both. You cannot say both. Both cannot simultaneously be true. The communication pattern of an administration that does not know what it is trying to achieve, that is managing its domestic political exposure on a day-to-day basis rather than executing a coherent operational design, is not strategic ambiguity. It is the absence of strategy expressed through the production of noise. And every operational planner in Tehran is reading that noise as signal because the absence of a coherent American narrative is itself a data point about the absence of a coherent American plan. Which brings me to the only exit that actually exists from the situation the United States has created. And I want to be direct about this because I have had these conversations in Russia with people at the level where these decisions are made. And I can tell you that the framework I am about to describe has been received with a seriousness that Washington should pay attention to, even if Washington cannot currently bring itself to ask for what it needs. The exit is Russia. Not because Russia is a friendly power with America's interests at heart, not because Moscow has any obligation to rescue Washington from a war of Washington's own making. Russia would be doing this as a strategic actor pursuing its own interests, and the fact that those interests happen to align with a de-escalation framework is the most important geopolitical coincidence of this moment. Russia has direct relationships with Iran as a strategic partner, with Israel through back channels that both governments maintain carefully, with the Gulf Arab states through energy and economic frameworks, and with the United States through the formal architecture of great power communication that neither side has severed. It is a major energy producer whose willingness to increase production or hold it stable matters to the global price trajectory that is currently punishing every American who buys gasoline or food. It has every economic incentive for a return to shipping normalization through the Strait and no strategic interest in a continued American military presence in the Gulf that would survive a negotiated settlement. The Russians I have spoken with understand exactly what they would be doing if they stepped into this role. They would be providing political cover for what is, in operational terms, an American surrender. Both sides understand that. The word surrender will not appear in any document, in any joint statement, in any press conference summary from whatever framework eventually emerges. It will be called an arrangement or a framework or a mutual de-escalation architecture. The language will be crafted by people who are very good at making necessary realities sound like chosen outcomes. But the operational content of the arrangement will be a recognition that the United States cannot achieve through military means what it attempted to achieve, and that the path back to something resembling normalcy runs through Moscow rather than through the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians are not going to negotiate directly with Witkoff. They are not going to negotiate directly with Kushner. These are the same two individuals who were the American faces of the pre-war contacts that Tehran now understands were used to establish the targeting parameters for the decapitation strikes, rather than to genuinely pursue a diplomatic arrangement. You do not hand your enemy the same door twice and expect them to walk through it without checking what is on the other side. Russia can be the interlocutor that neither Washington nor Tehran can currently be for each other. And that function, that specific intermediary role between parties that cannot speak honestly to each other directly, is worth more in this moment than any amount of military hardware, any additional interceptor production, any number of carrier strike groups repositioned in the Gulf. Because here is the arithmetic that Washington has not yet said out loud in any room where the people with the authority to act on it are present. America has no leverage. There is nothing on the table that Washington brings that Iran needs more than it needs the continuation of its current trajectory. Iran is winning this war by the only metric that matters in a protracted asymmetric conflict. The cost to the adversary of continuing exceeds the cost to Iran of continuing, and that gap is widening every day. The economic damage is global and compounding. The political conditions that Trump needs to survive the midterm cycle are deteriorating in direct proportion to the oil price, the fertilizer price, the shipping insurance collapse, and the daily casualty reports. This war was conceived in part as a political asset for a midterm narrative. It has become a political liability of the first order, and there is no military option available in the force structure being deployed that changes that trajectory before the timeline that matters electorally. The exit is Russia. The form of the exit belongs to governments. The timing belongs to no one, because the window in which calibrated exit is still possible narrows with every day that passes without a diplomatic framework being constructed. What Trump needs is not a victory. He needs a story. Russia can provide the architecture for that story in a way that gives both sides something they can use domestically. The only question is whether the people in Washington who need to make that request can bring themselves to make it before the economic consequences make the request irrelevant.